Well, I guess this is what everybody wants. This is the 9800X 3D. It is the latest processor from AMD with 3D V-Cache. What is 3D V-Cache? In a nutshell, it is the on-chip storage for the cores to put in temporary data. It's way faster to have it on the chip than it is to system memory. That's where it has to get written and then read from. That is latency, that is a lost performance. What the 3D V-Cache does is it doubles, triples the cache that's available on the chip, therefore speeds up all the processing for us, especially in our simulators. So that's what we're gonna be talking about today. But there's two important things I think we have to also talk about. One is, what does it mean to benchmark a CPU? One issue is the GPU running into a graphics card bottleneck. Now, I'll throw up on the screen something to consider. So a couple weeks ago, I was benchmarking the 10600K across all these resolutions in iRacing. And as the resolution increases, we're seeing a very small change in performance. From single 1080p to triple 1440p, there's only a loss of 10 frames per second. This isn't because the graphics card is an issue, it's because the CPU is holding back performance. At the bottom of the chart, triple 4K, that's where there's a GPU bottleneck. We can see the graphics card is 99% busy. That means utilized. That means running as fast as it can. And if we throw in a faster processor like the 7800X 3D, there is virtually no gain in FPS. The performance is hinged on the graphics card. So if we go to the other end of the spectrum at single 1080p, check this out. Look at the gains that the 7800X 3D has. It is critical for CPU benchmarking to remove the graphics card from being a constraint, from limiting performance. So today's benchmarking is at single 1080p resolution and triple 1080p resolution. If my explanation so far doesn't make sense to you, there's a great video by Hardware Unboxed where they described also for their CPU testing why they use lower resolutions. I've also changed the graphics quality per simulator to try and create enough headroom for when I got the 9800X 3D just a couple days ago, that it was still going to be challenging it and not running into a graphics card bottleneck. Turns out this thing is really freaking fast, and I still ran into a limitation with my 4080 Super anyway. Whew, a lot of words. Let's get into a lot of bar graphs. Here's the list of the shared hardware that I use for testing, the simulators and their version. Note that I'm using 23H2 for Windows 11. Yes, I know all the stuff about 24H2. I will do a follow-up that includes AM5 analysis with 24H2. I have not made any changes with my motherboards or my RAM from previous testing. And here's the CPU spec list, including all that L3 cache for the X3Ds. You can see that advantage, and I have the benched average boost clock. Simulators are not an all-core workload, so an average clock doesn't make sense. PBO and Expo is enabled on AM5 and AM4, and when it comes to Intel, I'm running the optimized boosts. And here's the pricing as I see it today. Yeah, the 9800X 3D is being scalped on eBay. The 13700K is actually compelling at under $300. And just a quick note, my triple 1080p was performed with NVIDIA Surround enabled across all titles. It just streamlines the benchmarking process. To benchmark Assetto Corsa, I'm using a LFM race replay. This is from a couple seasons ago, a wild race. We actually come to a complete stop when trying to do the rolling start. Anyway, we're seeing some interesting results, like right off the bat. There's only a 3% difference between the 9800X 3D and the 7800X 3D. But notice the giant gap back to the 5800X 3D. Clearly 3D cache matters here, but it's a 26% gap back to the first version of this technology. I'm using Content Manager to set all my graphic options and the weather system. It's basically set to very high, but we're still seeing a significant stepping between all of the processors. For example, if you have an i5 12600K or a 12400F, and you want to upgrade and improve your performance, you could see a substantial gain by going with a 13700K or 14700K, like over 30% difference between the two. Or if you're on the AM4 platform and you have a Ryzen 3000 series like the 3600, you could see 100% or greater gain by going with something like the 5800X3D. But when we go back to the top, it's a bit strange to just see a 3% gap between these processors. I think we're looking at some kind of limitation with Assetto Corsa, that the engine itself can only go so fast, that it is the limiting factor, not the processors. Or at least that's my theory. Pulling back the curtains for the full triple 1080p, it's an impressive result for the 9800X3D. It enjoys a 13% advantage over the 7800X3D and a 31% advantage over the 5800X3D. The fastest Intel processor that I have is the 13700K, and it's lagging behind by almost 40% to the 9800X3D. Now let's take a moment and consider the GPU busy on the left-hand side of the bar chart. This represents the amount of utilization of the graphics card, in this case a 4080 Super, for each one of these processors. It represents the percentage of time during each frame being generated that the GPU was doing meaningful work. The closer that is to 100%, the closer we are to totally saturating the graphics card and having a GPU or graphics card bottleneck. So let's take a moment and zoom in on the 9800X3D and 7800X3D and look at these other sensors that are tracked to show GPU usage and compare that to the GPU busy. The 4080 Super is 7% more busy, but that translates into 9% higher for a GPU load with the 9800X3D. It spent 41% of the time at the load limit, and it consumed more power, 21 watts more. Also notice that the GPU clock is lower on the 9800X3D, which is counterintuitive. However, that's how the boost clocks work. Usually you'll see a higher megahertz when you're not banging off the GPU limit. From a benchmarking perspective, looking specifically at the CPU, yes, the 9800X3D has a 13% performance advantage. However, these settings are beginning to introduce a GPU constraint. All right, so let's switch things up and now look at Assetto Corsa Competizione. Again, this is at single screen 1080p. The first thing I do is I look over at the GPU busy on the left to make sure that there isn't any kind of GPU constraint or limitation here. There isn't. So now if we look at the FPS totals, it's a pretty healthy lead again for the 9800X3D. It has a 16% lead over the 7800X3D and a 40% lead over the 5800X3D and the 13700K. This simulator can clearly leverage the 3D V-cache and make good use of it. If you were an early adopter on AM5 and picked up the entry-level 7600X, you would see a whopping 70% FPS gain by going up to the 9800X3D. That is phenomenal. Something we should talk about are the 1% and 0.1% lows. Those are represented by the white and black numbers you see, the bar charts within the bar charts. The idea is pretty simple. I think Gamers Nexus came up with this. I'm not sure exactly the origins, but if the average frame per second is 321 for the 9800X3D, what is the average frames per second for the worst 1% of all of those frames? In this case, it would be 206. So what stands out to me on this chart is that all three X3D chips have a bigger step down from that 1% low to the 0.1% lows. In contrast, if we look at the 13700K or even the 12600K, there's a tighter gap between the 1% and the 0.1% lows. Sometimes a big gap between the average FPS and these lows can help identify or indicate that there might be micro stutters going on. But when I see a trend line here for all of the X3Ds, it makes me wonder, maybe that's just a feature or a consequence of having this 3D V cache and the algorithms that are selecting the data that gets cached versus sent to system RAM. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud here. Increasing the resolution and moving on to triple 1080p. First of all, I have to point out the GPU busy. The 9800X3D has achieved 100%. That means in this scenario, we are GPU limited. That's why we see a much smaller gap between it and the 7800X3D. It only has an 8% lead, while it enjoys a 25% lead over the 5800X3D, which just gets ahead of the 13700K. The graphics settings that I'm using are a mix between mid and high, and I'm not using DLSS. So I think that's why we're seeing this big GPU utilization here. If I were to increase the resolution to triple 1440p, we're gonna run right into a GPU bottleneck, probably for the top 5 processors in this chart. If you wanna see what that looks like, check out one of my earlier videos. It was only using a 3080 Ti, but it shows what happens when you run into that bottleneck, not only at triple 1440p, but at triple 4K. With Assetto Corsa and ACC, I'm able to use replays because those closely represent what really happens real time in sim. The same cannot be said for Automobilista 2. In order to benchmark this one, I have to go in and do individual laps. 1 lap starting grid in Brands Hatch GT4s, 30 cars in the field, and I'm starting in the middle. The goal is to try and basically stay in the mid pack. At single 1080p, we are seeing some absurd FPS numbers. 444 frames per second from the 9800X3D. That's again a 13% advantage over the 7800X3D and a 40% gain over the 5800X3D. At this resolution and using any processor, any modern day processor, you can easily push well over 100 frames per second with the graphics quality at high. But something interesting happens when we go to triple 1080p. GPU Busy reveals that the 9800X3D is suffering. It's a victim to a GPU constraint. Once again, I guess high graphics quality was a bit too much for the 4080 Super. So we are slightly impacted with that. It only has, what, a 3 or 4% lead over the 7800X3D. But I think the rest of the processors are fairly compared. They're not seeing high GPU utilization. So those numbers are all good. But let's look at the 1% minimums real quick for the 9800X3D. Something's happening here. Its 1% low average is 151 versus 174 on the 7800X3D. That's a 13% decrease. And if we look at 0.1%, it's a 25% decrease. This is indicating we're having some kind of stutter or micro stutter, or something's going wrong with the frame times. So let's look at the frame time chart. This chart is a graphical representation of how long it takes to render each frame. You can zoom in on this, but to get the big picture, we're zoomed out. This is showing the entire benchmark run. Across the x-axis, we see that the bench is 111 seconds, and on the y-axis, that is the frame times. In this case, it's highlighted in blue. There are always going to be some spikes, all right? That's just the name of the game. And we can see that there's maybe 2 outliers here, one around 60 seconds, the other one at 85. Those are still probably too small to be perceived on screen, but they do stand out visually in this representation. If we use the same type of chart and we look at the 9800X3D, yikes, something is gone wrong here. I ran this bench a half dozen times. It keeps coming up like this at triple screens. It's fine for single screen, but but there's something going wrong here with triples. While driving the car and while looking at the screens, I don't notice any problems, okay? So this is just a data anomaly, which means just because you measure it, does it exist? I don't know. But this is something I'll have to investigate for part 2 of my review with this processor. So if you have any ideas, please leave a comment below on what could be happening here and how I should go about testing that. Next up is iRacing, and I'm using my Magello replay. This is a 50-car IMSA race. We're in the LMP2 here, and this is one of the most intense CPU-heavy benchmarks that I have that is still a real-world scenario, or what you would find in an official series. I'm using Class 1 graphics with a few tweaks, which includes triple mirrors, which are enabled even in this single-screen scenario. Regardless, the 9800X3D crushes. It's 20% faster than the previous generation 7800X3D, and it has, 27% advantage over the 13700K. If you have a 5700X3D or a 5800X3D, and you've been holding out waiting for a reason to upgrade to AM5, the 9800X3D could be it. It has a 40% FPS gain. And if you're using a CPU from 5 or 6 years ago, your performance could actually double with an upgrade right now. That's very, very impressive. When we move on to triple screens, the settings I have selected do not create a GPU bottleneck. We're at 91% busy on the 9800X3D, and it is still crushing. Its lead over the 7800X3D has stretched out to 23%, and has increased over the 13700K by 30%. The only blemish appears to be with the 0.1% lows. I would have to do more testing to confirm this. It could just be a little anomaly in the limited benchmarking I've done so far. I don't know if it's a trend with iRacing. Next up is Le Mans Ultimate. I've already done some GPU benchmarking with this title. You can check out my previous video on that because it is GPU heavy. This testing, though, we're focused in on the CPU, and we're looking at real-time data. I can't use replays with Le Mans Ultimate. For whatever reason, it seems like the refresh rate gets locked in and the FPS will not go beyond that. So I have to hop in the car and drive it around. In this case, we have 20 cars on track. I'm not doing a mixed grid. I find the AI to be too clunky for multi-class racing. One of the fast hypercars always crashes out and it'll just screw up the consistency in benchmark runs. So I'm just sticking to a single class and just try to hold on. I mean, just look up at the video capture here. This Porsche comes diving into the braking zone, bashes us. Maybe that is representative of an online experience and human drivers, but listen, I think we can all do better, including the AI algorithms. Going back to the benchmarks, again at single 1080p, the 9800X3D enjoys a 20% advantage over the previous generation and has, almost a 50% advantage over the 5800X3D. Super impressive here. Using the medium quality preset for the graphics, we notice that the 9800X3D is 91% GPU busy. So as we transition into triple 1080p, yeah, we're getting pretty close to a GPU limitation again. We're 97% busy for the 9800X3D and 95% busy for the 7800X3D. So that's part of the reason why the performance advantage has decreased. Now the 7800X3D just has a 13% advantage over its last generation. But I think what's glaring on this result are those 1% lows and 0.1% lows. We've got a problem here. This suggests that the frame dips on the 9800X3D are 20 to 25% worse when compared to the 7800X3D. So let's go back, let's look at the frame time chart again. Stacking the frame time charts on top of each other, we can clearly see some issues with the 9800X3D compared to the 7800X3D. I believe Le Mans Ultimate uses a completely different render engine than Automobilista 2, so that's not happening here. However, these are both live runs with AI. That's how I got this data, so maybe that has something to do with it. I have no idea, guys. I'm going to have to do more research into this, but I wanted to get you guys results sooner than later because I don't know how long it's going to take me to troubleshoot what's going on here. RaceRoom is the next simulator that I've tested with the CPUs. This is my first time actually benchmarking with this simulator, so if you guys have recommendations on tracks or cars that are higher resolution or complexity and difficult to render, please leave a comment and I'll pick up that DLC. But here are the results that we can talk about for single 1080p right now. This is Sepang with GT1s. I thought these cars are fun, and also I did all this benchmarking during the Malaysian Grand Prix with MotoGP. Shout out to Jorge Martin, who's probably going to win one over Ducati and Bagnaia. Speaking of winning, the 9800X 3D has a 14% advantage over the 13700K and the 7800X 3D. It seems like the 3D V cache is less of an advantage in this simulator. Notice how it's a tie between those two processors, and how the 5800X 3D is actually outperformed by the 7600X. If you're on an older processor like a 10th or 9th generation Intel or a 3rd generation Ryzen, there's a big advantage with going with any of these modern CPUs from the previous generation or the current generation. When I enable triple screens, there's really no surprise here. I mean, all processors take a ding. We're within the GPU abilities of the 4080 Super. So we're kind of just looking at the same lineup, the same gaps between the processors. Yeah, not much to talk about here. Oh, I used replays because I measured no performance difference between them and the real-time races against the AI. Last up is RennSport, which currently has a playtest beta that's live on Steam and Epic Game Store. Here are the single 1080p results. You'll notice that this is a very GPU-influenced title. I did some GPU analysis a couple months ago, so you can check out that for different resolutions and my other cards. I'm using the low quality preset, so the feed up top does not look very pretty, and it was not pretty in-game. I have no upscaler deployed or any anti-aliasing. I'm just trying to focus in on the CPUs, and even with that done, the 9800X 3D leads the way at 15% and has 93% GPU busy, and it's drawing 100 frames per second more than the Ryzen 5 7600X. Notice the big gaps for all the processors with 1% lows to the average and 0.1% lows to the 1% lows, which is to say this simulator would benefit from lots of optimizations, but it is in the beta, so they've got a ways to go. RennSport does not have AI, so I can't race against them. I have to use a replay, although the replays seem to perform or provide performance that's very similar to real time, so that's okay. Another issue with RennSport is that it does not properly support triple monitors. You'll notice when I switch here to triple 1080p, it's actually a stretched image with projection correction, and it's still just a single projection. I talked about this in my previous video, so go check that out if you're interested in the simulator. When we look at the GPU busy for this triple 1080p benching, we'll notice that it's above 90% all the way down to the 12600K, so this is not a great benchmark for CPU testing, even with low quality preset. So just as a reminder, all of my benchmark results are from this month, November 2024, so as these simulators update, these performance numbers will change. So in summary, I think we're looking at a really exciting and great processor here. There are some blemishes. I'm going to have to investigate those, so please leave comments if you have advice on how I should go about doing that. The new Microsoft Flight Simulator is also coming out. I want to bench it. I just don't know if it's going to be ready for that at its launch state. So anyway, stay tuned.